I woke up to the sound of furious knocking on my door, the kind of pounding that makes you think the house is on fire. Half asleep, I stumbled to answer, only to be greeted by a middle-aged woman with a clipboard, an aggressively pursed mouth, and an attitude that smelled stronger than the perfume clouds surrounding her. She glared at me as if I had personally offended her entire bloodline. "Good morning," she said, though her tone suggested she wished me anything but that. "We need to talk about your situation." I blinked. "Situation?" She sniffed, glancing behind me at my newly planted garden beds. "Your farm." She spat the word like it was something foul. "This is a neighborhood, not a barnyard." So, this was that neighbor. I had heard whispers about her when I moved in a few weeks ago, a self-appointed HOA president, except there wasn't an HOA. She ruled through intimidation, passive-aggressive notes, and sheer stubbornness. And now, I was apparently her new target. "I don't see a problem," I said, suppressing a yawn. "Everything's legal. The city allows backyard farming." She narrowed her eyes. "That may be, but I am very concerned about the aesthetic damage you're causing." "Property values, young man. Do you even care?" I fought the urge to laugh. "I don't think a few tomatoes and chickens are going to bring the housing market to its knees." "Karen." Because, of course, her name was Karen Huff. Like I had personally insulted her, she snapped. "This isn't a joke. People move here for peace and order, not dirt." I glanced at the spotless sidewalks, the meticulously mowed lawns, the soulless, identical houses lined up like they had been copy-pasted from a brochure. It wasn't peace and order, it was sterile. No wonder she had so much free time to harass her neighbors. "You know what's funny?" I said, stepping forward. "I moved here for peace. Peace from traffic noise and people telling me what I can do with my own property." Her eyes flared. "You'll regret this," she snapped before storming off. I should have known that wasn't the end of it. The next morning, I found a typed letter in my mailbox, covered in red ink like a high school essay gone wrong. Notice of violation was stamped across the top. It listed nonsense like unsanitary farming conditions, non-compliance with neighborhood standards, and my favorite, excessive presence of vegetables. Apparently, my tomatoes were an environmental hazard. I chuckled, tossed the letter in the trash, and went about my day. But Karen wasn't finished. Over the next week, she escalated. First, she called the city, reporting me for every possible infraction. The inspector showed up, took one look at my well-maintained garden, and left without issue. Then, she tried to rally the neighbors against me, claiming I was attracting vermin. But when people saw my backyard was more organized than most of their own, the gossip died out. I thought maybe she'd let it go, but no. Karen was just getting started. One night, I caught her sneaking into my yard. She tiptoed past the rows of kale, her chunky sandals sinking into the soil as she squinted at my chicken coop. I watched from the porch, sipping my coffee, waiting. The second she touched the gate, I cleared my throat loudly. She shrieked, stumbling backward. "Oh, I was just checking." "Checking what?" "My excessive vegetables." Her face turned an impressive shade of red. I had a complaint about the smell. I crossed my arms. "From who?" She faltered. "From concerned parties." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You do realize trespassing is illegal, right?" She straightened her posture, suddenly regaining her usual arrogance. "I am merely performing my duty as an advocate for the neighborhood's well-being." "Good to know," I said, pulling out my phone and holding it up. "Smile for the camera." Her expression dropped as she spotted the security light blinking above the coop. Without another word, she turned on her heel and speed-walked back to her house. I expected that to be the final warning. Surely she'd realized by now that I wasn't going to roll over and obey her fake authority. But I underestimated Karen's commitment to being an absolute menace. The next morning, I woke up to find my front yard covered in HOA violation notices, dozens of them. She had spent the entire night plastering them across my mailbox, front door, even my fence. I picked one up. Final notice: sea salt farming operations immediately or face legal action. I couldn't help but laugh. The sheer dedication was almost admirable. Almost. That's when I started digging. If she was going to go to war, I wanted to know exactly what I was up against. And what I found, oh, it was beautiful. Karen wasn't part of any official HOA. There was no HOA. She had been running a fake one for years, tricking people into thinking they had to follow her made-up rules. Worse, She had been charging people HOA fees, money she was pocketing for herself. Now, I had a choice. I could ignore her, let her keep ranting until she found a new victim, or I could play this game to win. I looked at my thriving garden, my chickens clucking happily, and then at the stack of fake violation letters in my hands. Game on. Karen had already exhausted her arsenal of tricks, but I had underestimated her ability to turn a minor annoyance into a full-scale war. It started small, mysterious complaints to the city about noise violations, which made no sense because the loudest thing in my backyard was a bunch of mildly confused chickens. Then there were anonymous reports about my unsanitary farming conditions. Each time, an inspector came out, checked my setup, and left with an apologetic shrug. Everything was legal, everything was clean, and everything was, to Karen's horror, completely within code. But Karen wasn't one to accept defeat. When she realized that legal routes weren't working, she shifted to psychological warfare. Flyers appeared around the neighborhood, warning about the health risks of backyard farming, citing non-existent studies claiming vegetable gardens were breeding grounds for disease. She even started a Facebook group dedicated to restoring the beauty of the neighborhood, where she ranted daily about my supposed crimes against suburban aesthetic. At first, most of the neighbors ignored her. Some even stopped by to buy fresh eggs or vegetables, rolling their eyes at Karen's antics. But then, things got weird. My mail started going missing. Trash cans were mysteriously knocked over in the middle of the night. Once, I came outside to find my entire fence defaced with poorly spelled insults and red spray paint. Down with Dirt Farms and Oh Hobo Veggies were among the more creative ones. I installed security cameras, but Karen must have caught wind of them because the vandalism stopped, only to be replaced with an even more absurd tactic. One morning, I stepped outside to find a dead rat lying right in the middle of my garden bed, suspiciously fresh, as if it had been planted there just hours before. I sighed, grabbed a shovel, and disposed of it, knowing exactly who was behind it. That night, I set up motion-activated cameras around my yard. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was ready. Sure enough, at around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with an alert. I pulled up the live feed and nearly choked on my drink. There she was, creeping across my lawn like a discount ninja, clutching something in her hand. She tiptoed toward my chicken coop, looking over her shoulder every few seconds like a cartoon villain. Then, suddenly, a noise echoed through the yard, a deep, guttural screech, something between a goblin's wail and a demon being exorcised. Karen froze, her entire body stiffening. The noise came again, this time louder. Then, a blur of feathers shot out of the darkness. Karen screamed, a high-pitched, horror movie-worthy shriek, as she flailed wildly, dropping whatever she had been holding. The creature lunged again, sending her running straight into my tomato plants before she scrambled to her feet and bolted out of my yard. I replayed the footage 3 times before I finally stopped laughing. The next morning, I found the source of Karen's terror, a wild turkey, standing proudly in my yard like it had just defended my honor. I had no idea where it came from, but it had apparently decided my farm was its new home. I wasn't about to argue. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't laughing. She stormed into my yard in broad daylight, her face red with fury. "Your farm is a menace," she shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "It's attracting wild animals now." I glanced at the turkey, who was pecking at the ground, completely unbothered. "Seems more like it's scaring off pests," I said with a smirk. "Worked on you, didn't it?" Her jaw clenched so hard I thought she might crack a tooth. "I am filing a lawsuit," she spat. I raised an eyebrow. "A lawsuit? For what? Having a turkey?" She crossed her arms. "For environmental hazards, noise pollution, and public health concerns." I couldn't help but laugh. "Karen, if anyone's a public health concern, it's you. You were trespassing again." She stormed off without another word. I assumed she was bluffing, but 2 days later, I received an official-looking letter. Karen had actually filed a lawsuit against me, listing a ridiculous number of fabricated complaints. My chickens were spreading disease, my vegetables were attracting rats, and my farm was lowering the value of the neighborhood. She even included blurry, badly photoshopped pictures of rats supposedly running through my yard. I showed up to court expecting a circus, and Karen did not disappoint. She had prepared an entire PowerPoint presentation complete with dramatic music and stock images of filthy alleyways that had nothing to do with my property. She even threw in a slide titled The Fall of Suburbia, featuring an ominous black and white image of my chicken coop. The judge, an older man who looked like he had seen every ridiculous lawsuit in existence, sighed heavily as he flipped through her documents. "Miss Karen, do you have any actual evidence that this man's farm is in violation of city codes?" Karen straightened her back. "It's common sense, Your Honor. Fresh produce and livestock in a residential area? It's disgusting. It's practically an apocalypse waiting to happen." The judge looked at me. "Mr. Jack, do you have documentation proving that your farm is legal?" I slid a folder across the table. "City permits, health inspections, and a few letters from neighbors who appreciate the fresh produce." The judge barely glanced at them before sighing again. "Miss Karen, I see no reason to proceed with this case. This is the most ridiculous complaint I've seen in years. Case dismissed." Karen let out a strangled noise, like a cat being stepped on, before storming out of the courtroom. I figured she would finally give up, but Karen wasn't one to accept failure. She had one last trick up her sleeve. 2 nights later, my cameras caught her sneaking into my yard again, this time with a bottle in her hand. The next morning, I found half my garden wilted and dying. She had poisoned my crops. That was it. That was the final straw. I wasn't just going to get her off my back. I was going to end this once and for all. I stood in my backyard, staring at the damage. My once thriving tomato plants drooped, their leaves curled and brown. The lettuce beds looked scorched, and the peppers had turned a sickly shade of yellow. The air smelled faintly of chemicals, something sharp and artificial that had no business near food. There was no question about what had happened. Karen had poisoned my garden. I had seen her on the security footage, sneaking in under the cover of darkness with a bottle in her hand. She had crossed every possible line, and this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived within an hour, and I showed them the footage. The officer, a tired-looking man who had clearly dealt with suburban disputes before, watched the video in silence. When it ended, he let out a long sigh and rubbed his temple. "So let me get this straight," he said. "Your neighbor, who has been harassing you for weeks, trespassed onto your property and intentionally destroyed your crops." "Pretty much," I said. The officer shook his head. "I assume you want to press charges?" "Oh, absolutely." Karen didn't even try to deny it. When the officers knocked on her door, she answered with a fake smile. But the moment they mentioned trespassing and property damage, she exploded. She accused me of provoking her, of ruining the neighborhood, and, best of all, of forcing her to take action, as if poisoning someone's property was a rational response to seeing a vegetable garden. Despite her tantrum, the officers weren't amused. She was hit with charges for trespassing, vandalism, and destruction of property. But I wasn't stopping there. I had already been gathering information on Karen for weeks, and now it was time to use it. I spent the next few days digging into her history. Everyone in the neighborhood knew she acted like an HOA dictator, but what they didn't know was that she had been scamming people for years. Karen had been running a fake HOA, tricking homeowners into paying her bogus fees. She had even convinced a few gullible residents that they needed to pay her for lawn maintenance, inspections, and community upkeep contributions. It was fraud, plain and simple, and I had the receipts to prove it. I contacted a few of the neighbors who had been paying her, and as soon as I explained what was going on, they were furious. They had been handing over hundreds, some even thousands, of dollars to Karen, believing they were following actual HOA rules. Now, they realized they had been scammed, and they were ready to fight back. With their help, I compiled a folder of bank statements, fake HOA notices, and written testimonies. Then, I did what Karen never expected. I took it to the local news. The reporter I spoke to was practically vibrating with excitement. A woman running a fake homeowners association and collecting real money from unsuspecting residents? It was the kind of scandal that would make headlines. Within a day, they aired a full segment exposing Karen's scheme. The fallout was immediate. Angry neighbors gathered outside her house, demanding refunds. People who had been bullied by her for years finally saw their chance to strike back. And then, the cherry on top, the police opened an investigation into her finances. Fraud, extortion, and tax evasion were just the beginning. But the biggest twist? Karen didn't even own the house she was living in. She had been renting the entire time. The actual homeowner, a distant relative of hers, had no idea about her fake HOA scam. When he found out, he was so furious that he evicted her on the spot. I will never forget the sight of Karen standing in her driveway, surrounded by moving boxes, screaming into her phone as a tow truck hauled away her car. The neighborhood, once ruled by her endless complaints and fake authority, now watched in satisfaction as she was forced to pack up and leave. The day after she was officially gone, I hosted a barbecue in my backyard. Almost every neighbor showed up, even the ones who had been too afraid to stand up to Karen before. People brought side dishes, kids ran around playing, and my chickens strutted through the yard like tiny farm kings. Someone even brought a cake that said, "Ding dong, the witch is gone," in bright frosting letters. As I stood there, watching the community finally relax and enjoy themselves, I realized something. Karen had spent years trying to control everyone around her, enforcing imaginary rules and punishing anyone who resisted. But in the end, all she had done was destroy herself. Her obsession with power had cost her everything: her reputation, her home, and her false sense of authority. And as for me, my farm was still standing. My vegetables would grow again. My chickens would keep laying eggs. And best of all, for the first time since moving here, I finally had peace. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.